Good afternoon or good morning. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar. At least it's afternoon in my time, where we're just going to run through some end-to-end edits. So that's our plan for today. Oh, let me just turn my monitor down so we don't get an echo. Before we get to that, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you're new here and you haven't joined a webinar before, my name's David. I'm part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark, and as usual we have a maximum of 60 minutes today. I'll probably use all that up, as we can just keep editing until that time is up or everyone falls asleep. So let's see what happens first. Regarding recordings and questions and so on, I am recording this so you can watch that at any time. It normally ends up on our Learning Hub tomorrow. And I'll make sure you get the link for that as well. Now, regarding the chat room, most, or at least some of you, have found that over on the right hand side. So that's a public chat room. So just be aware, anything you write, everyone will be able to see. So keep it nice and friendly. If you want to ask a question, it's not super busy today, so feel free to do that in the chat room if you like, or you can formalize it by adding it to the Q&A as well. That just might help bring it to my attention a bit more as well. If you're not interested in chatting or questions or anything like that, you can completely hide the chat or minimize it as well. So just using those two icons up in the top right hand corner. And that will just give you a bit more real estate on being able to see Capture One as well. All right, so let us begin. So let's bring up Capture One on screen. So what I've tried to do today is pick a number of different images. So you can see down here the sort of selection we've got. And I purposely haven't practiced too much. Might be a bad idea. Let's see. Apart from what we did on the webinar this morning, but I can never really remember what I've done. So just to try and keep it more natural and fluid and see how we go as well. And also a variety of different images and different techniques and so on. So that is the plan today. All right, so let's get rid of me and we can get started. So I'm going to start with this one. First of all, I'm going to hide my browser. Try to make sure I don't tread on this mic cable. I'm going to hide my browser just so we've got a bit more real estate. And this is a shot I took in Japan very recently. And I was pretty sure I was lined up dead square in front of it, which shows how good my skills are. But no matter. So the first thing that I'm going to do with this, and when it comes to my personal editing process, yours may differ of course, what's the first thing that we want to tackle? Now, before I get into doing color adjustments and all those kinds of things, I tend to personally prefer to sort out cropping and exposure and white balance first, and then I can worry about going on to do color edits and all those kinds of things. So let's first of all go up to my Keystone tool, and we can correct for Keystone vertical, Keystone horizontal, or both. Now, as I want these doors to be relatively square, I'm going to choose both, like so, and that will bring up 4 lines, which you can see on screen. So if I pick this line up, although saying that, 1 second, my Wacom being strange and acting up, might have to switch the mouse. That would be a shame. 1 second. Or maybe it's not my Wacom, maybe it's Capture One. Hang on, I'm going to just quit out of Capture One a second. Sorry about that, guys. And restart. So let's open up Capture One again. While that's starting up, let's help Mark out. At Mark, this is why, whoops, hang on. This is why we recommend Chrome or Firefox. All right, okay, so let's see if I'm back in business. Probably a conflict somewhere. There we go. So that was a strange one. Anyway, as I was saying, so I've chosen my Keystone tool up here. So let's just drop this so we can describe the error on Capture One. So I'm going to put this on either side or either corner of the door because I want this to be nice and square as I envisaged it first of all. So now if we click apply in the middle, Capture One will do its magic and then pop it out to the nice square photo that I hoped it was going to be. So now I can pick my crop. Let's do C for crop on my keyboard or choose it here. Now I'm just going to bring this crop in a little bit. Handy tip, incidentally, if you're cropping and you've done some perspective changes with the Keystone tool, you'll find in the crop tool, let's just bring this up, there's a checkbox here that says crop outside of image. Or yeah, crop outside image. So if we click that on and we grab an edge, you can see we can actually go beyond the image. If I go all the way over here, you can see obviously the pixels have been manipulated to correct for my poor photography. But if I wanted to fill this in with some content aware in Photoshop or something like that, then my crop does not restrict me. But as we're not going to do that today, I'll just turn that back off. So happy with the crop. Something like this. So now I'm happy with the crop. I'm going to press H on my keyboard and then Capture One will snap back to its view. Oh, by the way, I tend to, when I'm editing, as we're talking about editing, it's relevant, turn this on. This just gives me a margin around the image, which I find is a bit more helpful for editing. So this is known as the proof margin, and you can change that also within Capture One's preferences. And secondly, for my viewer, I tend to turn off the labels because I don't really need to see file name and all that kind of stuff if we're just into editing. So let's turn those off. Okay, so my editing process, we're often asked, what's the very first thing I should do? Now in my case, as you saw, I tend to sort out the composition first, but the next stage will be to look at exposure, there's only one, exposure, white balance in conjunction with levels as well. So looking at this shot, if I'm looking at my levels tool over here, exposure is pretty much okay, but I might just lighten it slightly. And what we're looking for in our histogram is that we want a nice spread all the way from shadows all the way to highlights, for example. So we've got some missing data here. Now the easiest thing to do in your levels tool is to click A for auto, like so. And what that does is take this figure, 228, and remap that to 255, which is essentially, if you imagine two fingers on either side of the levels tool, we're just stretching that out. So we get a nice spread from 0 all the way to 255. Because if you have that dead space around here, then that just leads to a flat image. So you want to try and avoid that, for example. Okay, so levels is sorted. Now it's a bit flat, so let's grab the midpoint of the levels. I'm just going to darken down the midtones a little. And even just using two tools, exposure and levels, we could actually say I'm happy with that. Let's stop there. But we're going to move on a little bit. Contrast, don't be afraid to use the contrast slider. It does a really nice job in Capture One. It's not as brutal as some contrast sliders that you might find in other applications, to be honest. And equally, I'd like to have this a bit more pop. Now if I go too far with contrast, of course, then I'm going to lose the detail in my blacks and my highlights are going to get too blown out. So I do still exercise some caution with the contrast, but clarity, of course, does a much better job of adding contrast, but just to the midtones. Now the only thing that we might want to be cautious about, if we look on our levels, because we've made some changes to contrast and clarity, we're just clipping ever so slightly. So I'm just going to hit auto again, and that will bring that back. that was a good question, a timely question from Delwood. I thought exposure was better before the auto levels. Yeah, so tweak the exposure first, because if you're well underexposed, you don't want to do auto levels, because then you're going to shift your exposure and then it's going to clip. So you want to kind of get the levels looking healthy and then do the auto levels. White balancing, yeah, this one is spot on white balance wise, so we're not going to touch that. But when we come to a different image, which I think will almost be the last one, then yes, we'll talk a little bit about white balance as well. Now, last but not least, highlight wise, let's just have a little look. We can bring some of the highlights back ever so slightly. Loads of detail in this. It's only a cheap Samyang 35mm, but did a great job. And also because of the detail in the wood and brickwork, we bring up structure, which helps to improve our edge definition as well. So that's a good set of basic corrections. Now, if we might want to do a bit with color, so let's go to our color editor and we bring this out and we make it a bit larger, just so it's easier to use. I'm going to go straight to advanced, just because that gives me more control on selecting the exact range, which you'll see here. So the advanced color editor, it's pretty simple to use. Start by grabbing this color picker, and I'm going to zoom in a bit, so I use Command plus on my keyboard just to go, let's go up here in the corner. So I moved my Capture One window a bit, and let's click here. Now straight away Capture One will give me a recommended range of colors that we're going to edit. Now it's hard to visualize, so if we turn on View Selected Color Range, then we can see exactly what that range is. If I turn that off, essentially everything goes to monochrome, which is not part of my editing range. So you see coat hangers down here, they're not part of the range. Warmer ready wood tones on the outside, that's not part of the range, and so on. So, but if I wanted to, if I think I want to edit the warmer tones, you see if I go this way we would get coat hangers in the frame. If we go this way, then we cut that out. So I'm going to just sneak into those neighboring tones a bit as well. So turn off View Selected Color Range, let's zoom out. Now I can just darken those down a touch, like so as well. Just a small edit, but it's always fun playing around with the color editor. And last but not least, it's probably enough. Do we want some vignetting? Don't know, just a tiny bit. So there we go. If we want to see the before and after, don't forget, hold your Alt key down, click on the reset button here at the top. So that was before, a bit flat and wishy-washy, and now this is after, like so. And again, let's just hit A there, and that gives us a bit more pop and contrast. Or if I bring my browser back, let's do image new variant, so that'll give us a virtual copy. So then we can see edit and how it was out of camera. Let's hide our browser and our tools, like so. Alrighty, let's have a look at your questions. Where were we? Let's just go to the Q&A tab. Does Keystone help with distortion? That's a good question, Manuel. No, it's not. It's not distortion based. It's perspective. So like falling down building syndrome. So if you have a camera, I have one here. Of course, when we take a picture, if we look up, then of course it looks like the building's falling over. So Keystone will correct for that. Or if we're looking to the side slightly, then we get the perspective falling off, so then we can bring that back as well. Now, as I made a complete mess of taking that picture, not really central at all, then of course this way we can correct for both. Distortion, that would be purely for the lens correction tool. Now I don't know if this lens, well, it's shot on a Sony, this particular shot, So if we go to our lens correction tab, we've got manufacturer profile, because Fujifilm, Sony, for example, they embed enough information in the raw data for us to be able to do lens corrections. So if we wanted to correct for distortion, it might be a bit distorted. Let's throw 100 in here. Barely. So that's also a really sort of good with this lens as well. So it's a Samyang 35. I borrowed it off one of my colleagues, and it done a great job. Barely any distortion. So in that case, I probably wouldn't even bother correcting it. The lens fall off, so light fall off, this will correct for light fall off. So if I put 100 in here, see, it's going to improve that quite a bit. But I tend to like vignetting, to be honest. So I always prefer to have the corners a bit darker. All right. So I hope that answered your question there, Manuel and Brad. And let's move on to the next one. Okay, so once again, let's hide, whoops, helps if you're in the right box. Let's hide the viewer for a second. And what shall we do now? Let's grab this one, because this has got a little bit more advanced, and then we can talk about some color grading things as well. So once again, first of all, before worrying about exposure and all those kinds of things, I'm going to grab my crop cursor tool and throw in a crop. Oh, by the way, when it comes now to grids and guides, so we are on 12.1 is the latest release, and in 12.1, if you're running a custom workspace, you probably won't find it, but if I right click and say add tool, you'll find a new one called grid. So let's bring out grid here, and what this allows you to do is switch between the various different compositional aids, which before you could only access from the preferences. So if we turn that on, I've now got my Fibonacci, golden ratio, rectangular, and so on. And you might find by default follow crop is turned off. So when you're cropping, you think, well, that's completely unhelpful, which it is. There is a use case for not following the crop, but most of us will want to follow the crop like so. So if you're wondering all of a sudden where your grids have gone, then they are in the brand new grid tool like so. So once again, let's go for that. And I think that's pretty good. And I want to rotate slightly. What I tend to do when I rotate is that I go into the angle box, because it's only going to be a slight nudge, and then I'm using my shift key and my cursor key, and then just to nudge it a little bit like so. It's only 0.3 of a degree, but just enough for it to fall off. Okay, so actually I want my grid off right now. There we go. You can also add, you'll see the grids cursor tool is up here. Oh, sorry, the grid action button, if you like, is up here on the toolbar as well. Okay, so back to the shot. Exposure wise, now if we were doing it like perfectly by the book, we'd probably go to something like this. But I'm guessing by the color of the sky and everything else, this is kind of a late afternoon or early morning, and that's got some nice atmosphere to it. So I'm not going to brighten it so much, just a small amount. Once again, hit A on my levels, and that's going to pop that in quite nicely. And same again, if we want to open up the shadows, then I can do so, but I don't want to go, I'm looking here right now, so there's all kinds of detail which is interesting to look at. But if I open it up too much, it kind of ruins the atmosphere of the rest of the shot. So that we're going to handle locally. So I'm going to open up the shadows a tiny bit, but not much. And I'm also probably going to add a bit of contrast and some clarity as well. Highlights are fine, so I'm not going to touch anything on that. But what are we going to do about the shadows in here, for example? Well, this is where layers or local adjustments, whatever you want to call them, come into play as well. So let's open up our layers panel, and I'm going to make a new layer, which is a long press, and I'm going to choose a filled layer. Now you might be thinking, why are you doing a filled layer? Because what a filled layer will do, if I make it and press M on my keyboard, that's going to affect the whole image. But the whole point of making a filled layer, which is like an adjustment layer if you're into Photoshop, is that step one is to visualize what the adjustment is going to do so we can set it accurately. And then step two is to get rid of that mask, and then we brush back in the adjustments to where it matters. But if you don't do it this way, you've got really no idea what your net result will be. So this is a way to pre-visualize what's going to happen. So let's press M again on my keyboard to hide that mask. So that's gone away. And now we can, I'm just looking at this area. So I am going to go for, let's open up the shadows more. I'll probably overcook it more than I need to, because I can limit how much of this adjustment I bring back in. Let's just zoom in slightly. And then I might actually add just a tiny bit of extra contrast so it doesn't go too flat as well. So now I'm happy with my edits. Let's zoom back out. Going to right click and say clear mask. So that will get rid of the mask, but it's still going to keep those edits intact. So let's say clear mask. And now I'm going to choose my brush here, or don't forget you can use B on your keyboard as shown right so, like now. And the important thing is that if we right click when we've got the brush menu up, then we can see these various different slider controls here. Now size and hardness is fairly obvious. That's how big the brush is. Hardness is how soft it is. Generally we want a nice soft brush so that it's not obvious that we're masking. But flow is the really important one here. And what flow does is that it controls how much effect we're doing on each brush stroke. So you can see here currently it's set to 2. So 2% if you like, because the range goes from 0 up to 100. So when it's set to 2, every pass of the brush or mouse, doesn't matter, every pass of the mouse or brush adds 2% of my adjustment. So it's going to build up nice and slowly until we get to what our opacity is set to. In this case is 100. So whatever adjustments I did just above me, behind me in high dynamic range, that's going to build up in 2% increments until we hit 100% of opacity. So we can build it up nice and slowly and have all the control we need as well. So now if I go back here and start brushing, every sort of movement, it's building up 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%. And then at some point I can think, let's just zoom in slightly. I can think that's probably good. We can even actually add a splash into the guy at the back here, like so, just to brighten up him a bit. There we go. Now you're going to say, David, that hasn't made any difference whatsoever. But if we turn the layer off with the checkbox here, you can see before and after. So just a bit more light into man number 170 and 123 in the back. It's not much, but we're just not staring into that black hole anymore, if you like. And then of course anywhere else we wanted to, we could just grab our brush and lighten whatever areas we want. So effectively we are dodging in printing terms. We're just selectively lightening different areas, but only just with our shadow control. Now if you think I've overcooked it a bit, then of course we can just go up to opacity and ramp that down, and that will give us no adjustment and then varying opacity all the way up to 100, which can be really useful at times as well. Okay, next, I think this image lends itself to a nice color grade with the color balance tool, and I could just go to the background and we could start playing with our color balance tool straight away. But what I'm going to do is the same thing, is we're going to add this on a new filled layer. And I didn't name the first layer, which is very bad practice, so let's call this one color grade. Color grade. Bad spelling. And what it means is that Once again, I can use opacity for flexibility at the end, but I can also combine one or more adjustments. So I'm going to, first of all, remember this is an adjustment layer, if you like, over the whole image. So let's have our cooler shadows. So you see that's going to affect just the shadow tones. The further I move this out, the stronger it's going to get. So I'm going to go over somewhere there. Mid-tones, I want to keep them a bit warmer. And then the sky, let's go for a bit of red, especially in the sky and so on and so forth. And also, as I said, combining different tools, let's just take our saturation down a little bit as well. Now again, if I think I've gone too far, I can drop the opacity down, so that's no color grade, or we can bring it all the way up like so. So you can reduce the strengthness, what word is that? Reduce the strength if you think you've gone too far, essentially. All right, now the only thing I do once I've finished, I might just brighten it a tiny bit, just a little bit, and then check my levels, just pull that out a bit, and then we're good. And I like vignetting, so we throw that back in, for example. What did Oswaldo say? How do you manage chromatic aberration besides of the auto mode? I don't know if there's much on this one to look at. Now, part of the lens corrections does fix the chromatic aberration. So based on this lens, a Canon EF50, that will correct for the chromatic aberration based on how we profiled the lens. But there is some variation lens to lens. So of course what you might want to do is click on here and say analyze, and then that will do a specific analysis for your lens and camera combination. Now if there's a batch of images, you can select them all and analyze, and then it will analyze each one individually as well. So go ahead and try that if you're having CA problems. And what did Karina ask? In the next session, could you go more into cropping with Fibonacci? You know what? I'd love to. I don't really like the Fibonacci spiral. Sorry, I'll just get my face out of the way. I don't really like the Fibonacci. I just find it really, there's too much going on for me personally. I know lots of people love it, but I'm not really quite sure where I'm supposed to be looking. Personally, I prefer just the good old rectangular. That's what I'm used to. But for yourselves, again, maybe I need to read up on why the Fibonacci is good, but I just can't really quite get my head around it. There's too much going on screen. All right, so let's have a look at our before. So that's option key, and then that's before and after. Not a lot of difference, but doesn't always have to be dramatic. So if I say new variant, let's just bring the browser up. So there we had our two edits. Let's hide our browser and tools. Let's turn proofing off, and you can see the before and after. But if we hold our shift key down and drag this slider, then just to illustrate, the local adjustment side of things, there's loads of detail in there. It was just really nice to kind of bring that out. Otherwise, I find with like really bright parts of an image or really dark parts of an image, that tends to be what your eyes end up staring at. So it becomes distracting. So just giving that a little lift, I think helped. So what does the chromatic aberration analysis does? So if you have CA on a lens, which is illustrated by kind of blue, is it blue and green? Bad memory, or blue-green purple fringing around the edge of high contrast subjects. So you might see it, tends to be on wider angle lenses. The 50mm I doubt will have any. But if you imagine like a high contrast edge like this towards the edge of a lens, then that's often where chromatic aberration pops in. Now when we profile a lens, we record how much chromatic aberration there is and we correct for it. But unless you're spending a bunch of money on lenses, there's still some variation lens to lens. So if you say analyze, then it will analyze that specific image and get rid of the chromatic aberration. So if you find you're seeing chromatic aberration, Analyze can help you do a better job. Okay, next image. A bit slower than I was this morning. Let's do a black and white, as we haven't done that, and then we do studio/portrait. So this image here, this is straight out of camera, and to be honest, we could probably say, well, that's done, because it looks pretty damn good, I have to say. It's from Chris Gibbs in Alaska. Does great environmental portraiture. So for this one, we barely need to touch it, to be honest, for any base corrections. I might brighten slightly. The only thing I would do instead of exposure on this one is to use brightness. And what brightness does is that it's more focused around the midtones. So whereas exposure will lift the exposure of the entire image, much like changing exposure compensation on the camera itself, or changing the exposure on the camera itself, brightness is much more limited to midtones. So the exposure over here on this side of his face is spot on, his jacket looks good, hat, all of that, but on this side it's just ever so slightly dark. So if we just bring up the brightness a bit, then that will lift the midtones without affecting our highlights so much. So just a slight adjustment there. Tiny bit more contrast perhaps, and a little bit of clarity. Oh, I was going to do black and white, wasn't I? Well, let's stop there then. First of all, we're going to do a different crop. By the way, with any of the cursor tools, you can right click and that will bring you up a subcontext menu. So I'm going to try a square crop with this one. So if I choose square and then go start to crop, then we can bring our square crop in like so. So it's a handy little thing to right click. For example, with the pan tool, which is H on your keyboard, when you're zoomed into 100%, if you right click, then you get a little mini navigator up, which means you can pan around the image like so, which is super handy. So just try right clicking on a few things, and then you'll be surprised what various different tools pop up as well. It's really neat. All right, so we've done our crop. Actually, I'm just going to move that over a bit. So happy with our crops. I'm not going to fiddle with settings too much more because we want to convert to black and white. So black and white, enable black and white like so. And now you have the 6 color tones, which talk or refer to the density of each of those tones. So if we grab the first slider, which is red, then if I go in this direction, that will brighten the red. If I go in this direction, that will darken the red. So that's mostly his skin tone. So let's bring that down a bit. Same for yellow, there's probably a bit in his jacket. Greens, not really anything, to be honest. Thought there'd be some in the background. Cyan, that's just on his scarf or bandana. Blue, also the same. And then magenta, very little. So you can moderate the densities to some extent with the black and white sliders. And then I'm going to go back, but tends to be a little bit flat. So you can of course use the contrast slider, but what we can do is use our curve tool, because that's going to give us a bit more control over just the contrast slider. Now in the curve tool we have 2 modes, RGB and Luma. And the difference between these two is that if we use the RGB curve, then when we manipulate that curve, it also upsets the color to some extent as well. So if we put in some contrast, then the saturation would go off, and it can affect what you've already set in those black and white sliders. So if you want to be absolutely sure that the tweaks you've made with those sliders don't change, the best thing to do is to go to the Luma curve, the second tab, because that will only affect contrast. All the color is stable. So it's probably slightly nitpicky, but if you want to be completely sure, then that's the sort of purist's way to do it as well. So I'm just going to bring down the shadows a bit more and just lift up the highlights ever so slightly. It's only a tiny amount, but just to add a bit more contrast. If I option click the reset button, we can see before and after. So just a bit more contrast. Now the only thing that sort of bothers me personally now is that this eye, or sorry, I should say this eye, is darker than this eye. So it's kind of somewhat distracting. So what I want to do is just lift this section a little bit so it matches. Not destroy the shadow because that's going to look weird, but just to open it up slightly. So once again, same method, new filled layer, like so. So M on my keyboard, it's going to affect everything. So what are we going to adjust here? Now if I hover the pan tool around this section, we can see that we've got this little orange line pretty much shows you the density range. So if I go here, that's almost a highlight. If I go here, you can see that's a shadow. So it's probably a good bet that the shadow slider is going to lift that up. Let's just zoom in 2 steps. So let's open up this a bit more. Now I don't care it's affecting this because we're going to do it here locally. So I'm hoping around there is going to match the right eye like so. But I'm pushing it further than it probably needs to be. So then we can right click and clear our mask. Grab our brush. Once again, let's make this a bit smaller. It's a nice low flow. Zoom in if it's going to help you, and then we can just gradually open up this side a little bit. Not by much, but now if I turn this layer off, you can see before and after. If it's too much, I might have gone a bit far. I'll just dial it back to something like that. So again, it's relatively sort of nitpicky, but I just find that less distracting. I kind of want to see his eye. So just a slight lift like that, for example. By the way, if you press M to see the mask, you can see it now. If you do Option M, or Alt as you might know it, that gives you a grayscale mask, so you can really accurately see where you've masked as well. So M for a normal mask, Alt key for a grayscale mask. Now what I might do if I take my erase brush, I think I just went a bit too high, so I'll get rid of that. Cool. Now I, in my usual style, would probably vignette this. Just going to bring the highlights down a bit. Now a standard vignette, the problem with the vignette tool, it's completely linear, so it will just do a vignette around the crop. The default is that it will go around a crop. But what we can do also with a layer is do a radial gradient mask, which is a fancy vignette essentially. So just to give you a bit more control. So if we do a new empty layer, and we're going to call this vignette or a vignette, whatever that is, a vignette. Change our cursor tool to a radial gradient mask, and then where I start drawing, the gradient will expand out from there, just in a completely circular linear fashion. Now if I go to just hover over the middle, I can rotate it, grab any of the dots, gives me a handle that I can pull out like so, and then the outer line is 100%, 50 in the middle, 0 in the center. So if I press M, that's the fall off that we're getting, 100 going down to 0. So if we want to make that a finer fall off, I can just go in, grab the middle line, and then go like this and go like this. Whoops, just undo that. I didn't click hard enough with my mouse, silly me. So let's do it again, just for demonstration purposes. So hover in the middle line, we can rotate. Outer line, we can change it like so. So let's do that. I'm just going to make it a bit more squashed, and then hover in the middle, then we can rotate and move something like that, and then feather. Oh, I've done it again, haven't I? What an idiot. Undo, update. Did I save it? There we go. Just undo saved me that time. All right. So now if I press M on my keyboard, you can see it, and then we can use any tools to change it now. Now if we're working in color, we can desaturate, we could do all kinds of things. So let's just take the brightness down because it will be a bit less harsh than exposure. So let's just do a combination of the two. And if you're not happy with its position, we can just hover back over, and then I can just move it around to something like that. Once again, if I've overcooked it, I think it's a bit too much, I can just bring these back up or use my opacity slider, of course. So I'm happy with that, I would think. Let's just have a look at a couple of your questions. Can I try with an overexposed? Yes, I think I might have one, if not. But really, there's no difference. So depending on your camera, how much latitude you'll have, you might find if you need to do a big push for underexposed, it's going to look flat. So you'll need to add contrast, and the same for overexposure, but same kind of rules apply. Is there a difference to going straight to black and white or applying a style that's black and white? So when you apply a style, it ticks on the black and white style box and throws in some other adjustments as well, depending which style pack you're using, because we have style packs, other people are selling style packs as well, of course. So you'll probably find it ticks on the black and white tool, moves some sliders around, plays with the curve, does some other stuff as well. Do you find that editing the color densities gives you a better result than any of the Acros film simulations? Well, the film simulations from Fujifilm work really nicely, and they're matched to the camera. So if you're shooting in Acros in Fujifilm with my demo assistant here, then it's going to look very, very close in Capture One. So it's that experience of what you see is what you get on the camera into Capture One. And of course they mimic very closely Acros, for example. So it's a different kind of thing and works really nicely. How are we doing for time? 15 minutes. Not rabbiting on too much. Oh, before we get to the next one, let's hold our Alt key down and look at before. There's our color, and after, like so. Let's bring up the browser. Let's say image, new variant, and let's put those two together. And then as I said, you know, this image was pretty fantastic out of camera, to be honest. So we could print that and be more than happy with it, of course. But what we can do if we're doing black and whites, oops, tools, browser. If we are doing black and whites, we got to this point, we could say image, clone variant. So that would give us a virtual copy. And then I could just go ahead and turn off the black and white tool. So then we've got our original, color, black and white. Oops, except I did it on both, silly me. So hang on, image, not clone, new variant. There we go. So then we've got our color. I'll get this right in a minute. So there's our black and white, image, clone variant. Okay, so there we've got our black and white. Here's our other black and white. So let's turn off enable black and white on that one. So now we've got a color version of our black and white. Sorry about that. It's obviously been a long day. Right, next image. Let's do our studio portrait, because then we can look at the skin tone tool as well, which works nicely. Now this shot, it is slightly underexposed, but if we were sort of going by the rule book, if we were to increase exposure to this, then it just looks over the top, blown out almost. It's not blown out, we've still got detail, but it's too bright. It doesn't look good. So we're going to reach a sort of happy medium, probably around here. And I am going to say A for auto, and that's brightened it more than enough, in my opinion. If we wanted to, of course, we could lift up the brightness a tiny bit as well, but that's plenty for this particular shot. Now once again we could say, well, that's enough for this shot, and it really is. It's perfectly acceptable. But if we were going into a deeper edit, like any skin tone, and I'm a prime example for that, there's always some variation of color around the skin. So if we just darken that down a bit, you can see the skin tone around here varies on the cheeks, which could be intentional with makeup, but then also up in the forehead here, and actually the neck's pretty consistent, and so on. So what we can do, if desired, is normalize the skin tones to a preferred reference point. So if we go back to our color editor and go to our skin tone tab, let's make our color editor bigger because it's a bit easier to use. And you'll see the skin tone tab looks almost identical to the advanced tab, except it has the addition of 3 sliders uniformity. Now what we're looking to do is a similar process that we grab our picker, but this time what we want to choose is our desired skin tone, so the reference point. So it's not the error, if you like, and I don't like using that word error because there's nothing wrong with her skin whatsoever, but we want our reference skin tone, not the part that we're trying to correct. So I'm going to choose somewhere down here, and once again Capture One will give us a suggested color range. The dot was the exact skin tone I picked. If I turn View Selected Color Range on, you can see what that's covering, and like as before, if we expand this out, we can go into different parts of the skin and so on, and you can see that actually picks up her hair, that cuts out some of her hair, and so on. So once you're happy with your selection, what you can then do is use these amount sliders, but these will just affect the pick color. So if we take a saturation down to 0, that's going to desaturate that skin tone, or make her skin lighter or darker, for example. Now these sliders have a shorter range than the advanced tab. So they're kind of a more precise or a finer control. Now what uniformity does is something a little bit different. So if you imagine that dot, hang on, let me put the cursor on it, this one here. So that's the pick skin tone, that was down here somewhere. So that was our reference point. So as we drag those uniformity sliders to the right, everything in that triangle will get transformed to that pick point. So everything in that triangle gets transformed and compressed down to that pick point. So that's what those uniformity sliders do. The further to the right you drag it, the greater the transformation. So if we do that, what you're going to see, if we drag it all the way to the right, you'll see anything in that range is now this color. And the same for saturation, and lightness will make it really flat and terrible, and so on. Now the issue, of course, here is that, excuse me, it's also affected her lips. It might have fixed, say, the difference in tone here, but it's also affected her lips, which we don't want. So you could go back and try to fix that with the range and the smoothness and so on, but generally it's a lot easier to just do it on a layer. So we're going to reset that, drop that back there for a second, and go up to our layers palette, and we're going to make a new filled layer once again. Let's call it Skin Edit, and once again we're doing this on a filled layer so we can visualize what's going to go on. So let's go to our color editor, let's open this up like so, and we do the same process. We're going to pick on our desirable or our reference point. Let's go here. I'm going to expand this out because I'm going to do all this on a layer, so I'm just going to make sure I can catch all the sort of skin tone range that I want. Pull across the hue, so that's going to equalize, pull across the saturation, and a tiny bit, but really nothing of that. So that's having the effect I want, but of course it's having the undesirable effect on some parts, so that's fine. But we've got our reference adjustments in, so we can hide our color editor, grab our layer, right click and say clear mask, and what we've essentially created now is a skin tone fixing brush. So right click, we've still got a low flow, we're still going to have it nice and soft, and then I'm just going to brush over the areas that I want to effectively paint in that reference skin tone, but of course with a level of subtlety that we couldn't do if we just done a mask beforehand. So when I think it's corrected enough but without looking fake, overly filtered or whatever. We can do a little bit down here, then we can stop. So once again, you might think, well, that hasn't made any difference whatsoever. So if we turn this layer off, then you can see before and after. So just the little bit down here. If we go Option M, then you can see the grayscale mask. M to see the mask, so we can just see it's mostly concentrated around here, for example, and M to turn the mask off. And again, if you've gone too far, we could take the opacity down to 0 or moderate it to anywhere in between. That's a really good point from Brad, because yes, it's called the skin tone tool because it was designed to work on skin tone, but in theory it can be used to equalize any range of colors. So if you've got a, what was your example? Yeah, circular polarized filter. Something's gone a bit too far, then you can normalize a whole range of colors to one. You could be shooting with like a blue background and it's not quite even. Skin tone tool could give you a nice perfectly even background. Shots of the sea or seascapes where you get some variations in color, and you might want that, but if you don't want that, the skin tone tool can do the same thing. So anywhere where you've got similar tones and you want to get, normalize it or equalize it, you can do so. We had a food photographer, Michaela, on our Instagram feed last week or 2 weeks ago, I can't remember, and she uses it on her background sometimes. She shoots daylight, rustic. Sometimes the color isn't perfectly even, or at least not as even as she would like. So using the hue slider on a mask, you can just balance it to that point where you think it's acceptable. The shortcut for grey mask, that's Alt key M. So if we go M on the keyboard, you can see the mask. Option M, grayscale mask. So M for the mask, Option M for the grayscale mask. You can also, of course, change that shortcut. You can also see it. Let's just close that. If we long press on the brush, you've got M for the mask. Oh, my head's probably hiding that. Hang on. If we long press on the brush, oh, it wasn't hiding it. We've got display mask, grayscale mask, and so on, like so. Would I use a heel layer to get rid of the hairs on a cheek? I think you'd struggle a bit on this one because you don't have a big enough reference point. That's probably a Photoshop job. But what I would use a heel layer for is, let's make a new heel layer. Grab my brush. I want to get rid of this white spot because otherwise we're going to stare at it. So Alt key to pick the source point. So I'm going to brush from that source point to this one. Oops, hide our mask just to get rid of that because that's quite distracting. So while Capture One is not a retouching tool for something as basic as getting rid of that object, then it works really nicely. Oh, we didn't crop this one, did we? C for crop. My mistake. Oh, we're still on square, so right click, unconstrained, and then this way we've got it back like so. I think I'm happy with that. Last edits, maybe just nice golden hair. Let's have a few more points of that. So if we compare that to before and after, option, let's get rid of our color editor, go away. Option reset, so that was before and after. If we bring our browser back, let's do a new variant, not a cloned. So then we can put them both side by side like so. If we shift drag our slider, then we can see the difference. So we haven't totally given her Instagram skin, but it just kind of has that level of balance. What can be really handy, certainly if you're shooting people, men, women, doesn't matter, and there's other body parts in the shot, arms, legs, or whatever. Quite often skin tone, I mean, mine is pretty close, but skin tone on hands, especially if you're cold, goes really sort of magenta, pink, etc., or arms, legs, feet, and so on. So if you know someone's doing this pose or whatever, then it's a really good way to equalize the skin tone. So maybe not make it absolutely the same because then it looks over the top, but to get to a more normal level, the skin tone tool can work really well for that. Okay, do we have time for one more? Maybe if we're like speed edit, let's see. Speed edit, let's do speed edit on Cuba because this has white balance and we did promise to talk about white balance. So let's just reset this guy. So white balance is definitely off. So what I do, if we go to our white balance tool, which is gone, so let's add it back. Oh, is it there? I can't read today. Add tool, white balance, there we go. So what I would do, you can do it by eye, for example, or you look for something that's grey reference or white. So I'm going to guess that maybe this shot in the back was on white paper, or the wall is white. So I might just click around a bit until it gets close, but that looks kind of too cold. So then I'll go back in and just manually warm it up a bit, like so. So it's not very scientific, but then you have the perfect white balance, but you also have the one that looks nicest. And once again, if we go back and now tweak the exposure, then we might then think, is that white balance good? We can see the red curve of the histogram is sticking out more than the others, so technically it should probably be closer to that, but which is probably right. If he was sat under some fluorescent strip light, that's probably close to what it was, but it's not very attractive. So I think I'd probably land at something warmer. It's just a bit more appealing. So we've got that. So that's only one edit. Let's do A for auto, have a bit more contrast, little bit of clarity, not too much. Open up the shadows slightly, like so, and we're almost there pretty much. The only thing I might do is, just thinking a second, the only thing with lifting the shadows is that it makes it a bit flat, which I don't like, but we also want to be able to see him, like our guy from Alaska, like his body is maybe a tiny bit too dark. So instead of doing the filled layer, let's just guess. So I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to pull up the shadows and I'm going to give it a bit more exposure, bit of contrast to hope for the best. Hope it's something around here. Grab a brush, right click, low flow, and then we can just open this up a bit, like so. And finally vignetting, which doesn't work on a layer, something like that. There we go, speed edit. So if we do option click, that was before, it's quite underexposed. I mean, really don't be afraid of under or overexposed images. As I said, the only thing you might find is that they get a bit flat when you correct them. So you'll need to dial back in some exposure. And what did our layer do? If we turn that off, turn it back on, just ever such a little tiny change in the in our subject, like so, but just to lift up this area more than anything else. But brightening up the stuff under the chairs didn't really do it for me. All right, so I think that brings us pretty much to bang on the hour. So thanks for joining us today. Always a pleasure to have you spend an hour with me. New webinars always go up on our Learning Hub. You'll see the link pop up on screen in a minute. I have a guest next week, which is John Chell. He's a photographer from California, and we just launched a new style pack, and he's a creator of one of those style packs. So we're going to have him on next week so we can look at the styles, do some image edits together, and so on and so forth. So please join me for that. So thanks again for your time. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you for the nice feedback, and see you all soon. Take care.